Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here and welcome to Healthy Living Live. I'm Chef AJ, and my guest today is Dr. Doug Lisle. He is not only the co-author of The Pleasure Trap, but the psychologist at both the True North Health Center and McDougall Live-In program, both conveniently located in Santa Rosa, California. He is the star of the weekly podcast, Beat Your Genes, Genes, which you can listen to live every Wednesday evening at 8:30 p.m. Pacific time, and even call in and ask questions. There's over 140 episodes now that you can access on Blog Talk Radio and iTunes. So please welcome Dr. Doug Lisle.
Hi, AJ.
Hi, we love having you here. You're like our resident psychologist.
Right.
And even Bailey decided to come stick her head up to see what you're going to talk about today. So it's funny because there's a microphone right here. It looks like she's actually talking. So we are actually going to talk about nuts and cardiovascular disease today. And the reason is some of you may know my weight loss story that I told at the McDougall Advanced Study Weekend. Is called From Fat Vegan to Skinny Bitch. You can find it on Dr. McDougall's website as well as on my YouTube page. And it talked about how I worked with Dr. Lisle to lose these 50 pounds, which I've kept off now for about 7 years. And one of the strategies I used was to decrease the amount of fat in my diet. And I found that for me, I had to go to no added fat for my weight to move. I was not cheating. Dr. Lisle knows this. I was eating an SOS-free diet, but even eating about an ounce of nuts a day, AJ couldn't lose weight. And so it's been almost 7 years now since I've added any fat, overt fat to my diet, not nuts, not seeds, not avocado. I eat a lot of greens. I eat a lot of purslane, and I also get my omega-3 fatty acid levels checked every single year. And they're not only excellent, the doctors are like, I can't believe how high your numbers are. But very often, especially when I speak at conferences, there are other wonderful plant-based doctors who insist that we need to eat nuts specifically for the prevention of cardiovascular disease, which runs in my family. And I got really concerned. And I asked Dr. Lisle if he could please talk about this because he was a statistics professor at Stanford. And when I look at the research, I don't know what it means. I know that sometimes it says it was funded by the nut industry, but I have no idea what it means. So I thought we would trust our resident psychology to actually look at the research and tell us, do we have to eat nuts to be healthy? Do we have to eat nuts for longevity or to prevent cardiovascular disease or perhaps reverse it? So take it away, Dr. Lisle.
All right, AJ. Well, I've heard about this issue. You know, I've had little echoes of it have come to my attention, but I haven't really bothered to investigate it. When I have investigated it in the past, I didn't see anything that was of any significant interest. But you know, if you're worried and you got people that are worried about this, we should take a look at it. And so let's the way we do this in science is we look at numbers. So I'm sorry, I can't just give you an opinion. We have to look at numbers, and that's what statistical people do. So we're gonna do, let's go find ourselves the best, some really excellent data. So hold on a second. So let's punch in nuts and cardiovascular disease into your computer.
Okay.
Sorry, everybody. People didn't know that I needed to wear reading glasses, but all right. So what comes up first for me is the first study is nut consumption and risk of cardiovascular disease. It's published through the NIH. That looks good. Let's see what it is. 2017. Okay. It's a guy by the name, or a person by the name of Gauche Ferrier. Looks like pretty fancy. Internationally, Journal of American College of Cardiology. 2017, November 14th. So if anybody's following along at home, this is where we're going to look. So the background of the study was to look at the association between specific types of nuts, and specifically peanuts and walnuts, and look at cardiovascular disease and whether or not there's a association between the intake of total and specific types of nuts and cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, and stroke risk. Okay, so this looks good. And now we're going to look through at what they used. Looks like they used the big Nurses Health Study, which was data collected from 1980 to 2012, 76,364 women. And then there's a second nurses' health study that looks like it was started a little bit later, 1991 through 2013. That's 92,946 women. So these are huge cohorts that obviously were very carefully done. So this looks like very good data. So if you're a scientist looking at this, you're going to be interested in finding out what these people found. The next thing is 41,526 men. So we now balanced it out for some men. The health professionals follow-up study, 1986 to 2012. So 26 years. So, and they started with people, everybody in these studies was free of cancer, heart disease, and stroke at the baseline. And so, so basically, it looks to me, the way we're going to do this, we're going to do this like I would do it, because we are going to do it. So what I want you to do, AJ, is I want you to take those three numbers, 76,364, 92,946, and 41,526, and I want you to add those up. So while I continue here, and that we get a total of how many subjects are in the investigation.
Okay, so
it's going to be over 200,000 people, which is going to be spectacular.
Okay, I got the first one, 76364.
Okay, the next one is 92,946. And the third one is 41,526. So we're going to add all those up and come up with a number of the total subjects that were in these studies.
Okay, I got 210,836.
So 210,800 and what?
36 people.
36. Okay, that's very good. I'll check you later. We wouldn't want to make a mistake today.
I actually used a calculator.
Okay. All right. So then what we're going to do is it looks like what they're studying, the big thing we're interested in is, I'm not sure if we care whether we die of a heart attack or a stroke. We're really concerned about whether there's anything that we can do other than things that we already know, like getting rid of smoking, probably reducing animal food in the diet, exercising, sleep. Okay, is there anything else, like, for example, specifically, these people are interested, they're taking a look at this huge database, and they're going to take their razor and they're going to narrow it down to nuts. They're going to see, did nuts have anything to do with reducing cardiovascular disease? So this is a very interesting question, and so we're going to look at this now. So it turns out that out of these 210,000 people that they looked at for about 25 years, there was 14,136 cardiovascular cases. Some of them were heart disease, some of them were strokes. So we're not too concerned about which is which here. We're concerned about the fact that we had 14,136 cases. Now, they're not all fatalities, but that's okay. So I don't want a stroke and then live. I just shouldn't avoid it. So we're just going to say these are bad things, and we don't want these to happen to us. Okay. So that's so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at whether or not, now they looked at nut consumption. So they looked at to find out whether or not if you ate nuts a lot, in this case it was a serving of nuts 5 times or more per week compared to people that almost never ate nuts. So it's people that over 25 years ate nuts 5 times a week, as opposed to people that did not do this. This is pretty good. So now we're going to look at 200,000 people, and out of those people, there's going to be a subgroup, and I don't know how big the subgroup is because they don't tell us here, but we looked down into the original data, we would be able to find it, but it doesn't matter. So let's suppose they've got a couple of thousand people or 10,000 people that check the box, that as they actually follow these people up with questionnaires every 4 years. So they've got huge amount of data They've got on average 5 different or 6 different self-reports across people's lives saying that, you know, I'm a kind of person that I eat nuts, you know, pretty much every day. That's what this is. So, as opposed to people that never eat nuts. So we got a nice distinction here. And it's going to turn out that they're now going to run data on these 14,136 cardiovascular cases. So people that either had a heart attack or a stroke, or they, you know, they either lived or they died. But whatever it was, this was bad. Okay. So we've got 14,136 cases. And now we're going to find out that if you were in the that I never ate nuts category, we're going to find out what your odds were of having one of these diseases. And if you were in the high nut intake category, i.e. 5 times a week for 25 years, whether or not, you know, what your odds were. Okay. So let's just say, before we get started, to what would be exciting. What would be exciting is if these guys over here had some amount of disease that they got, and then if you ate nuts, your per capita or per 100 people, there was less of those people that if they ate all these nuts, that they had less of the heart attacks or strokes. That would be a good thing. So let's suppose that nuts were really good, and for every 100 of these people that had a heart attack or a stroke, then there was like 50 people that ate nuts. That would be a big reduction. It would be very interesting to see that. All right, so we're going to look and see what they found. And what they found was that the hazard ratio, which is like, did it go from 100 people, you know, that had strokes to 50? The hazard ratio is 0.86, AJ. So that means that if a group of people, 100 of these people had heart attacks or strokes, then in the high nut group, 86 people would have had. So there's a bit of a reduction. I mean, it's interesting that it's there. So now we're going to try to see how valuable nut consumption would be, you know, to an individual as they look at this problem. Okay. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take, the first thing we must do is we need to see how much risk there is for the people in the study. So we're going to take the fact that we've got 210, what'd you say? What was your number, the total number?
210836. Okay,
so now we've got 14,136 people that had a disease process. So I want you to put 14,136 and divide that by 210,836. That will give us the statistical likelihood of having a cardiovascular or stroke crisis that either kills you or maims you or just scares the daylights out of you. Okay? So what's that number? 0.067. Okay. So your odds in this group of people, on average, your odds of having a heart attack or a stroke are 6.7%. Okay. Now, that I immediately, my statistician brain turns on, and I say, okay, that's relatively low. But remember, this was a group of people that started out that were free of cancer, heart disease, and strokes. So we're already looking at people that are reasonably, you know, healthy, and now we're watching them for 25 years, and then we're seeing what happens. So we're not taking people that that were a bunch of smokers that had already had a stent put in their heart and then following them. So we're following people that are disease-free at some point in their lives, probably in their 30s or 40s or 50s, whenever they signed up for this study. And then we're following them for 25 years, and this is what we get. So 6.7% of the people wind up with cardiovascular disease. Okay, that doesn't surprise us any. They're Americans. There's nothing about this study that says that these people are vegans or vegetarians or particularly health conscious or anything else. So, so this is what we've got. We've got 6.7% of these people wind up in some serious hot water. Okay. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to find out how valuable the nuts were for these people, for the people in this study that ate nuts 5 times a week for 25 years, we're going to see if the nuts did something to help them, or might have. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to multiply the odds of having a crisis, which is 0.067, and then we're going to multiply that by 0.86, which is the hazard ratio if you're a nut eater. So if we do that, what do you get if we go 0.067 times 0.86?
I got 0.057.
0.057. Okay. So what that means is that the odds of having a heart attack or a stroke if you are a nut eater was 5.7%. And if the odds if you were not a nut eater was 6.7%. Okay, so there's a 1% difference there. Now, in a very large study like this, a 1% difference, we don't kind of have time to explain statistics at this level today. But when you have that's a very small effect size. In other words, so it's there. That means that if you had 100 people in each group, if you take 100 people that were just the regular eaters in the group and 100 people that were the nut eaters in the group, that at the end of 25 years, that in the general people, there would be a 93.3% chance that you wouldn't have a problem, or that there would be, call it 6.7% chance that you'd have disease, call it 7 people, okay? So 7 people out of those 100 would have had a vascular or cardiovascular crisis of some kind. In the nut group, it would be 94% would be disease-free. So 6 people would have had a heart attack or a stroke. So the difference between the two groups, the nut eaters have reduced their odds from, instead of 93 out of 100 being successful, they've gone up to 94 out of 100. So they've helped themselves by 1%. So that's what the research actually shows on this topic. Now now statisticians. So if I'm going to look now at what they say. Say in the conclusions of the study, in 3 large prospective cohort studies, higher consumption of total and specific types of nuts was associated with the reduction of total cardiovascular disease, okay? So the 1% reduction that they're saying here is statistically significant. And so you will hear people say this. So if you were a lay person that was looking at this and you didn't really have confidence in yourself to actually go down through the arithmetic the way we just did, then you would read the conclusion and you would say, wow, well, there it is. And that would be true. So the people are publishing the truth here. If you also were maybe a little bit more sophisticated and we're looking at the hazard ratios of 0.86, you would say, well, that's a 14% reduction. So that seems like a big deal. But remember, we're going to have to compute that against the overall risks that the disease is associated with in order to get any feel for the value of the issue. So if somebody tells me that they can reduce my odds of, I don't know, Kawahawa syndrome, and Kawahawa, they can, that if I eat 1,000 raspberries a day, that I can reduce my odds of Kawahawa syndrome by 50%. And they've got research to that effect. But if Kawahawa syndrome only impacts 1 in 7 billion people, what the hell do I care? All right. So what we want to do is we have to take a look at the overall risk of the disease process we're looking at, and we have to then compute to see the value of a change in hazard ratio. In this case, it's a hazard ratio reduction of 14%. And then which makes us 0.86, or you're 80%, 86% just as likely to have the disease process if you're the nut eater versus the not nut eater. And then we wind up, then we can look at it in terms that, a grade schooler could understand. This is out of 100. Okay, so out of 100 people, the 93 of the people that didn't eat nuts are still alive and disease-free. And if you ate the nuts, it's 94. So that's what that is. Now, if I have anybody really sharp and paying attention and listening to this, they're going to understand that this 0.067 for the non-eaters of nuts is not quite accurate. And that's because, remember, the nut eaters are in that group. So when we take them out, the 0.067 is going to go up a little bit. It's probably going to go up to 0.068 or 0.069. So there's going to be, so we might have to adjust this infinitesimally, but it's almost perfectly accurate. Okay. So now you know, AJ, that if you let's back the camera up and really take a look at what it is that we've learned from this. It's interesting. We're not gonna stop at one study, even though this is an extraordinarily comprehensive study, because we've got 3 cohorts for over 20 years per individual in the study, measured multiple times, and 200,000 people. So in other words, when you look at numbers that large, that are that immense, then what you're going to see is that the ratios that you're observing should be extremely stable. So you're not going to have a new study from somebody else that's going to say, oh, no, the effect is twice as large as you guys found. It's like, no, you're not going to find that. You may find a small study with 2,000 people in it that shows an effect size twice as large, but that's because there's something biased about that study. It's some way that the data was collected that is giving us an ungeneralizable observation, okay? When you get a study this massive, this carefully done, these are excellent estimates as to what these effect sizes are. And it also tells me something as a statistical person, that there's a real correlation coefficient there. So it is true that the people that eat nuts are having a little bit lower risk factors. So we now have to say, okay, that's pretty well established. Now we don't know why. So we don't know that it's the nuts that are actually causing this little bit of an effect. It could be what we call in science the third variable problem. Okay, so you and I are going to look at that in a minute. This is what's known as a correlational study. So I've told you what I did for a living as a kid.
No, not as a kid. I know you were a statistics professor at Stanford as an adult, but I don't know what you did as a kid.
I was a statistics professor at Stanford. Before that, I mowed lawns, and I made more money mowing lawns
than you do now working at the True North Health Center. That's
right. You got it. You got it. So I taught statistics for many years at 3 different universities, including Stanford. And so I spent years sort of taking students through problems just like this. So students would come in and they'd say, Dr. Lisle, actually those days they called me professor, but hey, you know, that's how that works. No more. So they'd say, well, Professor Lisle, this is what this says, you know, what about this? And I would say, well, let's take a look at it. And we get out the original study. So we wouldn't read what was in the magazine, the little synopsis. We wouldn't read what the Mayo Clinic little bulletin says. What we did was we'd actually go to the original study like you and I just did, okay? And we would fearlessly and confidently take out our calculator, and we would trust our mind's ability to step through the basic logic, and then we would see what we would see, okay? So that's what we've seen today. So I want to point out that on the basis of this evidence, which looks to be highly credible and very stable, it would appear that the 1% difference is the maximum possible effect size that could be possibly attributed to nut consumption. In other words, if there's a third variable that's actually correlated with the nut consumption, if there's anything about these people that eat nuts that is also helping their cardiovascular disease that has nothing to do with the nuts, then the effect that we're observing on the nuts is reduced. So this is telling us that the maximum possible effect of nut consumption on human cardiovascular disease reduces the odds by 1% over 25 years. Okay? So now what we're going to do, just for our entertainment, is you might say to me, well, I don't know what that means. Like, should I be worried about 1%? And you know, and I'd be saying, well, you know, AJ, 1% is 1%. I don't know how else to tell it to you, but we could use another statistics term to give you a feel for this, which is what we call the expected value of a function. Okay, so we would say, okay, well, let's look at these vascular incidents that you have a 1% greater chance if you happen to be in the group that's not eating nuts every day. So if we did that, the big bad thing that could happen to these people, and did to some of them, was they could die of a heart attack or a stroke. So now in this case, these people didn't all die, but let's just suppose they did. So let's suppose we have the worst case scenario, and these 14,136 people died of a heart attack or a stroke. And if they happen to be in the nuts condition, they had a slightly reduced likelihood that that was going to happen. In fact, it's about 1%. So now what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, well, what is the amount of life that is lost by the heart attack or the stroke? So it's going to turn out that if we were to compute this, we're going to find that the average length of loss of life is on the order of about 10 years. So the average person is not having heart attacks, you know, at 42 or 52 or at 62. Okay, so we're going to find that, particularly if we take smoking out of the equation, we're going to find that the average person is having their heart attacks, and dying of heart attacks around their 70th year or so. So it's going to be essentially the estimated cost of a heart attack or stroke that's fatal is going to be about 10 years of life. So what we're going to do is we're going to multiply that 10 years, which is 12 months, that's 120 months. And we're going to multiply that 120 months by 1%, which is the advantage that the nut consumers demonstrated in the study. So it's 120 times 1%, which is, AJ?
Wait, 12?
No, 120 times 1%. What's 1% of 100? 1. What's then 1% of 120?
12. 1.2. I'm sorry, I'm so bad at that's okay. Why you're here.
That's why we're doing this, okay?
1.2.
This is exactly why we're doing this today, okay?
1.2.
So 1.2 months. So 1.2 months is about 36 days, 37 days. So that would mean that the people that ate the nuts 5 times a week for 25 years had an outcome if all those people died from their gut disease, which they didn't. But if they did, the worst case scenario, the total protective effect of nut consumption in this study would have been somewhere around 36 days. Okay? So now you have a way of gauging what the value would be from taking this risk of not eating nuts, okay, at these high levels. So that's what the scientific evidence tells us at this point. So, but now what we're going to do is we're going to do something smart, and that is whenever we see one study and we look at it, and as impressive as this study is, which I have to tell you, it's very impressive. It's a tremendous amount of work going into this. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look on the internet for another study that looks like it, but it's not the same people, but it has the same kind of methods that they use, the same kind of questions that they're asking, and we're going to find out, did they have results that look similar? If the results look similar, then it gives us confidence in everybody's results. If the results are vastly different, then we're sort of back to the drawing board, and we're not quite sure what to do. So let's look up, again, net consumption in cardiovascular disease, and what we're going to find. Let's go do it again. Net
So may I ask you something though, or
Sure.
is it too soon?
Absolutely.
Well, okay, great. Well, there's a few comments that I want to share with you, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
People keep asking what kind of nuts. I'm not sure that's relevant. We can also link to the study. But Veronica was saying, well, if you're that one person that lived, then maybe it's relevant to you.
Yes.
But I guess what I'm saying is, when they do these studies, are they taking people that are healthy vegans that are eating an A+ True North diet like me without nuts and comparing? No. Do you know what I'm saying? So.
Right. Good question, AJ. The truth is, obviously, the 6 or 7% of people that had vascular disease were the worst people in the study for diet and health outcomes. So we're talking about the F students. Okay, that's obviously who that is. So the question is, let's suppose that, but let's be fair, that so over 90% of the people don't have any problems. In fact, it's more like 95% of the people. It's the bottom 5% of the class that's flunking here. Now, so the question is, is there a protective effect if you're in the middle of the curve? Let's say you're just an average eater and health person in this study. The answer would be that the effect that we're observing of that 1% would be vastly reduced, because your risk factors are a great deal less than the people that are getting hit. People that are getting hit are at the bottom of the pile here. Okay, so that's a very, very good question. You have to study the risk factors, and the numbers that you're seeing are not on healthy vegans. We would fully expect that people that would live more healthfully than the average person in these studies would have very significantly attenuated numbers. So that, good, very good question. It's a good question that came from Peanut Gallery. Okay, very good.
But the thing is, like, how do you know it's the nuts that made them live longer? What if they just did blueberries instead of nuts? I mean, it just seems like.
Good. That's where we're going to go. So we're going to go, but before we're going to go to that, we've got time to do this today. So we're going to take our time and make sure that we get this right, because I want people to have a really good look at this question, because I know that people are anxious. So I probably tried to answer this question 100 times or 50 times in the last 5 years. I've had people coming up to me at conferences and tapping me on the shoulder and asking me, they ask me all kinds of things. Should I take vitamin C when I get a cold? You know what I'm saying? They ask all kinds of things. And one of the things they do is they ask about this. And I said, I've said up to now, I haven't seen any compelling evidence. And that now remains to be true today. Okay, now, so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at, we're going to look for a very similar study to this one, but is with a different group of people. Okay, we also want something that looks fancy, but we don't. Here's a British medical journal. That's really fancy, okay? 2018, so it's this year. And it's Susanna Larsson in Sweden, okay? So it's a major study, 61,364 Swedes were followed for 17 years. Really good. Okay, so now this is extremely similar to the studies that we just cited from the United States. So this is a very large cohort study. They're looking at them for 17 years. And what they're doing in the background is that they say net consumption has been found to be inversely associated with cardiovascular disease mortality, i.e. nuts have been found to help reduce mortality. That's how scientists talk, inversely associated. Okay, that means nut consumption goes up, cardiovascular disease goes down. So people have found that just in the study that we just talked about, which was found. But the association between nut consumption and the incidence of specific cardiovascular diseases is unclear. In other words, there's congestive heart failure, there's heart attacks, there's ventricular fibrillation, there's different kinds of issues. So we're going to now look. These guys are going to like take the magnifying glass out, and they're going to see if there's if the nut consumption, the effect that has been demonstrated, holds up across different kinds of problems. So the problems that they're looking at for are heart attack, heart failure, atrial fibrillation, and abdominal aortic aneurysm. I don't even know what that is, okay? So they're going to look at 4 different problems with their very large cohort, and let's see what they found, okay? They found that that there was very similar kinds of things. The people, let's see, compared, so that the people that consumed a bunch of nuts as opposed to not a bunch of nuts were 3% less likely to have atrial fibrillation. So that actually very, very, very tiny effect size there, okay? Let's see, but for heart failure, let's see, the corresponding hazard ratios were between 0.87 and 0.98. So that means that it's around we would have 0.86 in our study, okay? The previous one. This looks like theirs isn't as good. So the hazard ratios are not as useful. It was not associated with the aortic valve stenosis, ischemic stroke, or intracerebral hemorrhage. In other words, nut consumption was not found to be helpful at all with the aortic valve stenosis, ischemic strokes, or intracerebral hemorrhages. Those are out. The only thing that they were able to find was a very, very tiny effect for atrial fibrillation, and also an extremely small effect for heart failure, okay? The heart failure was significantly less. Let's see now. Nut consumption, 1 to 3 times a month, 1 to 2 times a week, 3 times a week. Okay. Heart failure, HRs, okay, it was actually unbelievably small for heart failure. So let me make sure I'm reading this right, AJ. Compared to the consumption of no nuts, the hazard ratios for atrial fib were 0.97, 0.88, for 1 to 2 times a week, and 0.82 for 3 times a week. Oh, no, they were a little bit better. So it's a little bit of effect there. Then for heart failure, it was 0.87, 0.8, and 0.98. Okay, so the people that consumed nuts more than 3 times a week had 98% as many heart failures as people that didn't consume any nuts at all. In other words, it was almost exactly the same. Strangely enough, the people that consumed nuts 1 to 3 times a month were at 87%, which is very similar to the 86% that we found in our study, and 0.80 for people in the middle, 1 to 2 times a week. So what you get is a thing that says it goes down a little bit if you rarely, it goes down a little more if you have 1 to 2 times a week, and then your risk goes back up if you're eating nuts more than 3 times a week. It goes back basically to the very same ratios if you didn't have any nuts at all. Okay, here's a clue. In science, when you find nonlinear relationships of a variable, so a little bit of nuts seems to help a little bit more helps a little bit more, then more, gets worse. When you have a pattern like that, you know that your variable is worthless, okay, or basically worthless. It's a death to a scientist on that question. It's like, oh God. So now we're getting down to, oh wow, we're going to reduce your risk a little bit if you eat nuts 2 times a week, but if you go over 3, ooh, then your risk goes back up. It's like, oh God, it means you got nothing, okay? And all through this, what we see is we see extremely similar numbers to the numbers that we saw in the United States. So let's look at the conclusions. Conclusions of the study is that nut consumption, or here, this is beautiful because we did not see this in the other study as part of the conclusion. So this is beautiful writing here. These findings suggest that nut consumption or factors associated with this nutritional behavior. So they're admitting that the nuts may not have anything to do with it, but it may be something associated with people that eat nuts. Very important caveat, good scientist, okay? These findings suggest that nut consumption or factors associated with this nutritional behavior may play a role in reducing the risk of atrial fibrillation. May. And possibly heart failure, i.e., it's not looking so good for heart failure, because if we're up at 3 times a week nuts, suddenly we're back up to 98% of the risk factors. Okay, so what do we find from this? We find that 2 different investigators looking at 4 different cohorts with an average of 20 years of follow-up on each of these cohorts, looking at over 250,000 people in 2 different societies, find almost exactly the same numbers. It's good. That tells us that the question is basically settled scientifically. And all points of it aren't settled, but the effect size of whatever nuts do for cardiovascular disease, we can see that the effects are extremely small, okay? They are associated with something like, at most, a few days of life. So that's where we are with this, and that's fine. It shows you that if you take out a telescope powerful enough, you can see a footprint on the moon. So we have taken out a statistical telescope of unbelievable precision. So we've looked at over 250,000 observations, and so we can grind this and see if there's something here. There is. There's something here that keeps showing up. It's an extremely small relationship. So the question is, though, once we've established a relationship between 2 variables and we have a feel for what it is, if we were interested, because we're academics, and we said, you know what? There appears to be a tiny little thing there. There's a hangnail in our theory, and it says, you know what? Looks like eating more nuts is something about that is associated with a little tiny bit better outcomes. Do we want to know more? Now, one person might say, hey, looks like nuts are protective. Let's eat nuts. But actually, folks, that's one person's opinion, but it actually doesn't have anything to do with science. That's just taking a stab at something. So what we have established here is a correlation coefficient or an association. We have no idea what the cause of that association is. Now, one person might say, well, I've seen that if you eat nuts, nuts have good things in them and improves the lipid profile, so therefore we think that nuts are definitely doing something. You got nothing, okay? So all we have is a correlation coefficient, and it's an interesting question. So we're going to spend a few more minutes today, AJ, like academics, just like academics would do. If I was in my office back at the university, I would take out my calculator, take out a pad of paper, and I would start thinking through what might be what's called the 3rd variable. So this is known as the 3rd variable problem. This is a classic problem in science and in statistics. So we're going to walk through the 3rd variable problem so that people can understand it better, and then we're going to think about whether or not there's any possible 3rd variable that could be associated with this effect. Suppose that you and I were political scientists. God help us, AJ. But let's suppose we were. Nah, make it economists. Political economists. That's good. That's better. Just kill ourselves now. All right. So suppose that we were political scientists and we were very interested in the wealth of nations. And so we were interested in what was causing some nations to be successful, their people to do well economically, and other nations to be poor. This is actually an unbelievably important problem in the world. It's probably more brains are trying to solve that problem than probably any other problem. So there's a lot of people looking at that problem and trying to figure it out. And so what they do is they study what we're going to call variables. And so the variable of interest here is going to be per capita income in a country. That's like heart disease. You either have it or you don't, or you got more disease or less disease. That's an outcome variable. What we're going to try to do is get a variable that's a predictive variable that's associated with it that we think could be controlling it. That's like net consumption. So if we got heart disease over here, some people have it, some people don't. We got net consumption over here, some people have a lot of nuts, some people don't. Are these two things associated with each other? Okay. So the first step in science, you know, on some certain types of problems is we got to first see if there's an association. Okay. So now we're going to be a political scientist and we're going to say, okay, we're going to look at all the countries of the world. We're going to get numbers on how much money the per capita income is. And then we're going to say to ourselves, what do we think could be associated with it? So we might say things like, how much education did people have? And we put that as a variable. How many years of education? That's a variable. It's a predictive variable. Okay. You see, well, more education, does that lead to higher incomes? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Okay, we're going to run that number and find out if they're associated. We could also say things like, how far from the equator is the center of the country? Okay, and so if somebody runs that and they say, wow, you know, actually, we're going to make it north of the equator. How far north of the equator is the country? Turns out there's an association. The further north you are from the equator, the higher the income there is in the society. It's like, oh, wow, look about that. Maybe there's something about being north of the equator and out of all the hot sun helps people economically. I don't know. Somebody else says, you know, I think it's English speaking. Let's face the facts. America is really rich. People speak English. England is pretty rich. People speak English. Australia, that's in the southern hemisphere. Forget about your theory about the equator. They're in the southern hemisphere. They speak English. They're pretty rich. Okay. Singapore, they're successful. I think they're an English-speaking country. It's like, hey, I think we got something here. I think English-speaking is the variable. Okay. Now, so somebody else says, yeah, I don't think English-speaking is the real deal. I could see that you have an association, but I don't believe that association. I think that there's a third variable in the thing. It isn't English-speaking causing people to be rich. It's English-speaking is associated with the fact that you have a democratic, representative, limited constitutional government with free markets that you're going to see in Australia and the United States and in England. And that if you're Venezuela, you don't have that. So we can't go to Venezuela and start teaching everybody English and expecting them to look like San Diego in 10 years. Because we don't think that the variable that's causing English-speaking countries to be rich is English. We think it's a third variable that we're missing. Okay? Obviously, that's true, but it doesn't get so obvious when it comes to other things. So the third variable problem gets to be interesting. Somebody might say, for example, that heart attacks, they believe, are caused by stress. They don't think they're caused by diet. And it turns out that they think a big thing that causes stress is traffic. And so they think that if you run a correlation coefficient between how many cars a country has and how many heart attacks they have, they think that they've got it. And you know what? They would. The more motor vehicles per country that a country has, the more heart attacks that they have. The correlation is pretty good. It's a hell of a lot better than net consumption and heart disease. It's a very good correlation. So now some psychologist says, I don't care about all you people with your mumbo jumbo with cigarette smoking and diet and exercise and sleep and anything else. I think you're all crazy. I think the issue is traffic stress. And I've got a correlation coefficient here that is very strong. And so you guys can just go pound sand, because I believe that what people need is that they need to have less cars and less stress, because when we go to the blue zones and we find out that people are living longer, we're going to turn out that a lot of those people live in societies that have less cars. So I think it's frickin' traffic. And I know that when I'm in traffic, I freaking feel really stressful, and I feel like shooting people, and I get short of breath, and I'm yelling at people in the car next to me. So don't tell me that that's not a variable. Okay? Totally reasonable. So what are we going to do? Well, we've got to do really careful science. We've got to look at everybody's patterns of association, and then we're going to try to figure out, is there a plausible third variable? If the third variable is actually correlates with the outcome variable even better than this other variable over here, then this variable over here may not be so important. So watch. English, democratic free market government, and wealth. It's going to turn out that democratic free market government correlates better worldwide with wealth than does English. So English is correlated with free market governments. So that association between English and outcome, it's there, and we can see it. It's a correlation coefficient. It's an association that is statistically significant. But we see that there's another variable that's better, and it actually explains what we're seeing more crisply and has a lot of reason for us to believe that that's the issue. So Switzerland has a democratic constitutional government. They are wealthy just like the United States. They don't speak English, okay? And so we start to see, Luxembourg, I see how this goes, okay? So this is going to be helpful. So this is the third variable problem. So we have a weak but statistically observable relationship between high nut consumption and a very slightly lowered risk of cardiovascular disease. Interesting. One person may say, oh, it's the nuts. I'm telling you, the guy with the idea that traffic stress is causing heart disease is a freaking idiot. Okay, he doesn't understand. He doesn't know that all he's looking at is the countries that are wealthier have more cars, countries that are wealthier eat richer food, and as a result of that, the rich animal food that they eat is causing the heart disease. He doesn't understand that the causal chain isn't what he thinks it is. But I believe that I know that when I see this little association between nuts and reduced cardiovascular disease, that in fact I believe that there's this chemical in nuts that are really protective, they're anti-inflammatory, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I've got a big story. The question is there a third variable in the equation that's associated with nut consumption that could be responsible for the outcome, that is actually a better correlation than the nut is to the outcome? Well, people aren't looking very carefully at that, but when the Swedish study looked at that, they would find that when they controlled for other cardiovascular variables, the effect of nuts on outcomes went very low, almost nothing. So this starts to, as the people said in their conclusion, nut consumption or behaviors associated with that, with people that do that. Well, let's think about something. Suppose, and remember, none of these studies are on vegans or vegetarians or anything else under the sun. So we're talking about a few percentage of the people running into trouble. We think we know who they are. If we were to ask any intelligent, informed cardio scholar about what they think the cause was if these people are non-smoking, I'm not sure if they were. I think maybe they were. I don't know if they were. Let's suppose that those 210,000 people were non-smokers. And we've got 6.7% of them are having vascular disease. Let's take our first guess at what we think would be responsible for that vascular disease. I know what my first guess would be. Pastrami and cheese sandwiches with mayonnaise for 25 years. That's what I think the cause is. Okay? So when we look at those 6.7% of people, and we see that this fraction of people wound up in trouble, and you're asking me why do I think they ran into trouble? It's because I think that their diet was very rich with animal food. Now, it turns out that there was 6.7% chance of vascular disease out of that group. And I think I know who they were. They were people that are eating cheese and pastrami sandwiches and French fries and cheeseburgers. That's who I think they were. That's my hypothesis. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, but if out of that group of people that was in trouble, out of the nut people, they had 5.7% of those people. Well, who do I think those are that ate nuts? And also almost everybody that ate high nuts, they wound up in the same boat exactly as the people that didn't eat the nuts. I think that the tiny effect size is likely to be responsible in the following way. That it isn't that the nuts have some protective elixir in the nut. It's that, think about this. If I'm eating nuts 5 times a week for 25 years, we're going to call that a peanut butter sandwich, right? So if I'm eating 5 peanut butter sandwiches a week, what am I not eating?
Pastrami.
I'm not eating pastrami 5 times a week. I'm eating peanut butter 5 days a week. So I'm hardly surprised that if we're eating peanut butter 5 days a week instead of something else, that something else I don't think was freaking rice and potatoes or any other healthy food. I think it was some rich food, okay? And now we say, well, now wait a second. If we subtracted out the rich food, if we control for that, and instead don't worry about whether it was nuts or not, but if there's a dip in the rich food, in the rich animal food by X%, i.e. by the equivalent of 5 doses of nuts a week, let's run the correlation coefficients on people that ate whatever that is, a couple of thousand calories less a week of animal food. Will we get that corresponding 1% reduction in cardiovascular disease? I believe we will, okay? Now, I can't prove it. I'm just a scientist with a hypothesis. I believe that the third variable in the equation is that when the increase of nut consumption for that group, that cohort, has led to a reduction in the amount of animal food that they eat. And therefore that change, which is a modest change in the people's diet, because you're only talking about, probably 1,000 or 2,000 calories a week out of, 15,000 calories. So you get a change in their behavior, and we wind up with a little modest change in their health, okay? Not a shock. So hopefully, boy, I took a whole hour. Sorry, AJ.
That's okay.
This is a sort of a comprehensive look. And, whenever anybody comes to me, sort of worried and worrying about what some study says, and somebody says that I have to eat, I don't know, razzleberries to reduce my odds of colon cancer, and, there's a correlation coefficient. The doc says that this is really important. It's like, I'm never impressed. None of these correlation coefficients like this, whenever I hear anything like this, usually make much sense to me. And the reason this is true is that it's actually relatively inconsistent with the theory of evolution. It doesn't really make sense that there's some magic food out there that is going to stop some specific disease. Heart disease and cardiovascular diseases are caused by toxic processes as a result of dietary patterns that are inconsistent with the natural history of the organism. It is always possible that some healthy food or healthy food extract in concentration could have, or some medicine could actually have a medicinal or pharmacological effect that might be useful in any given case. That's always possible. But as a general process, I don't think that green beans are better than oranges, and I don't think that oranges are better than blueberries, and I don't think blueberries are better than kale, and I don't think the kale is better than the potato, and I don't think potatoes are better than nuts, and I don't think nuts are better than rice. I think natural food is natural food, and that whenever anybody starts looking for correlation coefficients between some specific disease and some natural food that they're including more of, I think they're actually I think they're looking for health in all the wrong places. In case anybody is interested, I wrote an article by that name for this specific problem 20 years ago in Health Science magazine, and it then became the chapter by that title in the Pleasure Trap. Okay, so we morphed it into it. It's a Sherlock Holmes story about how Sherlock knows how to look in the right place to find the answer to the mystery. The people have a strong tendency to look in the wrong place. They seize on a correlation that looks exciting. I understand this. Correlation or association is what they're talking about. This is where we begin a question. And so when we hear that there's an association, in science we say, interesting. Has it been replicated? Answer, in this case, yes. Is the association strong? Not in this case, it's not strong, it's actually very weak, okay? Is it stable? Yes. Well, then that's interesting scientifically. It may not be that interesting practically, but it may be interesting scientifically. So I believe that the association of nuts to vascular disease is scientifically interesting. I believe that it is a very little practical interest, but it is an interesting one. And I think that some grad student somewhere may write a PhD thesis where they go back into this database and the databases that are available, and they may determine, some vegan grad student maybe, that I might be inspired by this discussion, may be able to go into these databases and find out that the actual reason for that reduction in vascular disease turns out to be a reduction of the animal food as a result of the inclusion of nuts in the diet. Okay, so I'm speculating now that could be the case, and it would be kind of cool if it was. But for those of us that are in this arena, the message is this: don't eat shit. Don't get caught in the bottom 5 or 6% of a distribution where you wind up with a heart attack or a stroke. Okay, those people were irresponsible with their lives, and they ate shit. Okay, and it turned out that if a bunch of them ate a bunch of nuts, it didn't help hardly at all. They wound up with basically the same amount of pathology either way. We know that there's people that ate well and did intelligent things and didn't wind up with a pathology. In fact, most people ate pretty poorly and didn't wind up with a pathology. Okay, but we know as healthy eating plant-based people, however strict we are, that we should be doing an excellent job, or we should not be in the bottom 10% of this class and put ourselves at risk. Okay, for one last look at this to help you understand the statistical potency of this. If you were in the bottom 10%, we are taking the 10% losers out of 100, the worst of the worst, the genetic worst and the worst behaved people. Of the non-nut eaters, 7 of those 10 wound up with a heart attack or a stroke. In the nut eaters, the guys that ate a bunch of nuts that were in the bottom 10%, 6 of them wound up with a heart attack or a stroke. Okay? You can tell me whether or not, or anybody else, whether or not you think that's great and that's important and that you need to be really careful. That judgment is up to you. I know what I think, and I hope that I've made that clear.
Well, this has been really incredible.
Okay.
There's
All right. Yeah, go ahead.
Ritvik is watching, and he's a college student. He said he wished he had a statistics professor like you.
I love teaching stats, AJ. I have to tell you, I loved it so much that it's kind of every now and then in this life, I think, I can't believe that I'm not teaching stats, because, you know, there's jobs that you have in life, like, I don't know, that there may have been some jobs that you just absolutely loved. And there's 2 jobs that I loved. I loved delivering sprouts for Dr. Alan Goldhammer in Portland. I was his driver, and he paid me $6 an hour.
I think that's what he pays you now.
Nothing has changed.
I was going to say, that's what he pays you in True North.
I loved that job, but it was finally time for me to move on in my life and go to school. But I loved driving sprout truck for Perfect Sprouts. The cute girls would say, "Oh, it's the Perfect Sprout guy," and I'm like, "Yeah, that's me." Nothing good happened, but it was fun. And another funnest job that I ever had was teaching statistics. And so now obviously we do new things, but sometimes it's fun to look back on those days.
That was great. Well, thank you. So the take-home message everyone is saying they understand is, don't worry about having arugula versus artichokes or kale versus chards. Don't eat shit. You heard it today from Dr. Doug Lisle.
That's what I said. Perfect.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lisle. And thanks all of you for watching another episode of Healthy Living Live. I'm Chef AJ. I make healthy taste delicious, but Dr. Lisle makes it understandable. Take care, everyone.